We are back and thrilled that you are as well. You are watching The Human Resource. We are coming to you from ICRC-TV in Cincinnati, Ohio. My name is Pandy Pridemore, and I have Karl Ulrich with me back in the studio. You're all talking about this topic, and so Karl said, you know what, we really probably should go over some of the details around this because we saw this coming, but we didn't see this coming. We're going to talk about non-competes and why they are history. Who would have ever thought the Federal Trade Commission would come in on this?
Federal Trade Commission.
When did they decide to join the party?
Yeah. It is. The proposed rule first came out, I think, in January of 2023, and we've been hearing some talk about that in political circles for some time. I think the proposed rule was in 2023. The proposed rule came out. The final rule came out in April of this year. I think the proposed rule was in its scope and its breadth was somewhat of a surprise. But so a lot of businesses and a lot of employees whose employment situation has largely been defined in many ways by non-competes are grappling with how to deal with it now.
The National Labor Relations Board they were pushing and pushing and pushing. So everyone was focused on them. Mm-hmm. They were going at it. They were very open and clear and communicating about it. And quite frankly, when the FTC even dabbled with it, everyone pushed it away and said, "Oh, that's it's unconstitutional."
Yeah.
FTC can't. They will not be able to pull that much power. And then they hit us all between the eyes.
Right. Yeah, the FTC came out with a rule, and their basis for making for promulgating the rule that they did was the antitrust laws and the rules against unfair competition. And so they've relied upon the antitrust laws to frame rules which effectively declare most non-compete agreements in the employment context and in some cases in non-employment contexts to be unfair competition and therefore void. So we have a new lay of the land, potentially effective. This new rule is potentially on September 4th of 2024. So, we have a few months to prepare, but there are also some things going on, which we'll talk about in a minute, that may yet call into question the effectiveness of the rule. So we'll have to stay tuned on that. And by that I mean there is some litigation, particularly in federal court in Texas, the Fifth Circuit, which is challenging the FTC's authority to pass this rule. And that litigation is still ongoing, the effect of which could be, we don't know exactly how that's going to happen yet, but the effect of that litigation could be that the rule gets put on hold, either temporarily or permanently, after the court hears motions. Now, the court is expected to rule based on my last check of this. There are several courts dealing with it, but the primary litigation right now, the one that's sort of leading the charge, is in the Texas, one of the Texas federal courts before a Trump-appointed judge, and she is expected to rule, I believe, at the first week of July. That's at least the current schedule. Now that may or may not hold, but at least we'll get some indication from the district court judge in early July, hopefully, that what direction they're going with respect to the validity of this FTC rule. Of course, there'll be appeals, there'll be other issues, so stay tuned. But for now, the rule's there. It's going to be effective, barring any judicial intervention, on September 4th.
Now, we're talking about non-compete, the restriction that they cannot, once they leave your employment, they can't go work for a competitor or a company of a similar influence or industry within a certain period. Help us understand exactly, because there's a grandfathered group. So talk to us about that.
Right. Well, so what the rule says is that that any non-compete agreement entered into after September 4, the effective date, is invalid. Any non-compete agreement entered into prior to the effective date, September 4, is invalid except for non-competes with senior executives. And that term is defined in the rule as being individuals who have high-level policy-making authority for the employer.
And that's the point I want you to really focus in on. Because I'm talking to some clients and they're going, oh, well, that means that all of our directors and senior directors, I'm going, no. Be more explicit in what they mean by policy and decision.
And that's a great question because it's not 100% clear yet. But from the rules, it is clear that the FTC considers this exception to be a fairly narrow one. That senior executives involve those individuals who have a senior policy-making responsibility for the organization, have the ability to legally bind the organization without authority or without intervention or approval by someone else in the organization. Now, that is not a director. That is not a supervisor. That is a president, vice president, somebody who is able to go out and negotiate a contract, sign that contract, bind the organization individually without any, they can accept input from others. That's still part of the process. But ultimately, it's their authority, their responsibility, their decision for the benefit of the organization. That's very high level. And if those elements are in place, if the individual in question has that type of authority, then they fit into the senior executive exception and a prior non-compete will stand. Going forward, though, even senior executives, any non-competes with senior executives that are entered into after September 4th would be invalid.
That's dangerous.
Yeah, so you're really going back, with the exception of senior executives, what the FTC rule is really doing is going back and invalidating, in some cases, agreements that have been in place for 10, 15 years or longer.
And that could be the reason why the person stayed.
Very, very likely. Now, keep in mind that a lot of businesses, particularly businesses involving critical sales relationships, are dependent upon those relationships. Those relationships frequently are controlled by individuals who are out in the sales force doing the one-on-one contact with customers, and they protect those relationships with things like non-compete agreements. Now, there are other alternatives to the non-compete, and we should be clear about that. There are other strategies that can protect the essential investment of businesses in those relationships, but the non-compete as a remedy to that problem is in question in the extreme right now.
So what I want you to do, Karl and I both want you to just go back and look at the documents that you're using and look for this very specific language, because I know that some of you have employment agreements that have a column in there about non-compete and another column about non-solicitation and another one about confidentiality and possibly something in there about proprietary or trade secrets. Look, you have to review all of this to the finest detail. And let's go back to what Karl and I have been telling you since we started this years ago. There are certain documents that have to be reviewed and written by legal counsel. These are not documents that you can give to your HR consultant or you can pull off the internet. A document to approach our moving forward, this new way of going about business and trying to protect our companies. It has to be legally written and created so that it's binding. Because again, think about what you're trying to protect. They're taking away your ability to keep some of your information. Think of all the experience that could be walking out the door right now because non-competes are not available. Right. So, Karl, what should a company be thinking about moving forward?
Well, a couple things. If the rule stands, and it's possible that it would, by September 4, you will have to notify all employees who have existing non-competes that those non-competes are invalid. and that will have to be done in writing. There is a notice in the rule, a draft notice that is a template that you can use for that purpose. But you'll have to be that notice will have to be sent to anybody who is a current or former employee who has a non-compete agreement would have to receive that notice. That's the first thing. The second thing to consider is if many agreements that are drafted have not just non-compete provisions, but they have other restrictions in it, like non-solicitation you mentioned, or confidentiality provisions. Those are still valid and would still be enforceable. They're not affected necessarily by the FTC rule. And those are good protections, different kinds of protections, but also can be utilized to protect the business investment in certain things, right? So not always a substitute for non-compete provisions specifically, but you really got to look at those agreements to make sure that you have those alternatives already in place. If you don't, certainly you want to work with your legal counsel to devise a strategy for crafting those alternative protections in a way that is going to not implicate the FTC rule. That is still going to be valid. So there are ways to get at the essential protections you're looking at, but you're going to have to do it a little differently than you used to.
This is not exciting anybody.
Well, it's exciting me because, I'm going to have a job for the next few years. It's great.
Well, you know what? I just wrote down here. I totally, and I'm glad this is why we work so well together, and I totally forgot to put emphasis that anyone that has left the company that may still have another 6 months left on their non-compete or
Absolutely.
a year, whatever it might be, that notification has to go out to them.
That's true.
So you've got to get back into your archives.
And the other thing I'll point out real quickly is that it's not even just about employees. It can be independent contractors. Frequently, independent contractors in some contexts have non-compete agreements. Now, that's problematic potentially for other reasons, right? But that's a road we don't want to go down today. But to the extent that those non-compete agreements exist in a independent contractor context, they're covered by the rule as well. So you'd still have to necessarily comply with the rule as to those restrictions. Yeah, it's a pretty broad-ranging fundamental shift in how businesses conduct their asset protection. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
And you really do need some careful thought about next steps here. If you have legal counsel, reach out. Talk to them. You're going to need to comply and consider options and alternatives.
Okay. Worst case scenario. Our letters go out in September. Next March, all the court hearings and everything has gone through, and all of a sudden they say, "Oh, you know what? Maybe we have to reverse this." Will the employers be able to go back to their employees and put them back on non-competes as a condition of employment?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends a little on how the court acts, but typically in these situations, because the FTC rule has such far-reaching implications, the court is being asked to intervene before the effective date. That is to say, if some action is going to take place in the court system, it's likely to take place before the rule actually becomes effective, and then it'll be placed on hold typically through the appeal process until some final decision is rendered either by the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court one day down the road, which may, make permanent that hold on the rule, or it might lift the hold and say the rule goes forward. So it's going to depend a little bit on how the courts actually act, but what I would say is that we're likely to know what that landscape will be by mid-July, and we should be able to certainly advise our clients a little more carefully at that point.
So what does that mean? That means, that you must keep listening, because that's what we're here for, right? To keep you abreast on all these changes, whether we like them or not. That's what we do. And we love it. Remember, Karl Ulrich at Sebaly, Shillito and Dyer. If you need to get a hold of him, his email is
KULRICH@ssdlaw.com. Thanks, Pandy.
It's that simple. Guys, thanks again for listening and watching The Human Resource.